Salam sejahtera, bersama saya Rizal Zulkapli dan ini AWANI Global. Kita ingin melihat kepada isu cyber security ataupun keselamatan cyber dari peringkat serantau dan juga apakah cabaran untuk negara-negara di Asia Tenggara serta di peringkat serantau untuk bekerjasama untuk memastikan ancaman berikutan cyber security ataupun keselamatan cyber dapat ditangani secara bersama, dan juga apakah isu yang akan mendepani ataupun cabaran yang akan mendepani negara seperti Asia Tenggara dalam isu keselamatan di cyber ini. Untuk membincangkan perkara tersebut, kita bersama dengan Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, dengan izinnya Head Center of Excellence for National Security CENS, Rajaratnam School of International Studies RSIS Singapura. Doctor, let's look at the importance of cyber security in Southeast Asia. Why is it important to talk about this, especially right now in Southeast Asia, and what are some of the threats to Southeast Asian countries that you can foresee moving forward with regards to cyber security?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Cyber could involve the cyber kinetic threats, cyber offensive action. It can also involve, secondly, threats concerning, let's say, social media manipulation, disinformation, hybrid warfare. There's so many terms for these things. And it's good that this question is asked because we need to be very, very clear what are we talking about. Now, if you look at ASEAN, for example, it's very clear that certain strides have been made in terms of advancing our level of understanding of the threat, particularly at the leadership level. For example, if you look at the gains or advances that were made at Singapore International Cyber Week late last year, and before that, the various meetings of the AMCC, and also the ASEAN ministers responsible for communication. I'm saying this because it is quite clear to me over the last 1-2 years, the various forums at the top level, the official level, which should be tasked with responsibility about talking about these issues, these have coalesced. Things are clearer now. Why is that important? Cyber is a fraught issue. Fraught, meaning if you look at the ways nations look at the issue, to some it's a communications issue, to some it's a security issue, some have their defense officials in charge, so that's one. And secondly, you look at some of the ways that ASEAN, countries at the individual level look at the issue. Some have a cybersecurity organization, one mechanism. Some approach it from a multi-sectoral level. Some have, quite frankly, high levels of capability, and some, on the other hand, are still feeling their way, meaning their computer emergency response teams, the CERTs, the technical people, they're still growing. Others have much bigger CERTs. So the reason why this is pressing is, firstly, we look at this through a lens which is variegated. It's multifaceted, different skill levels, different capability. And the third, it's a little bit obvious, but it's worth saying, is a sensitive issue which can involve damage to a nation's psyche, society, and obviously to infrastructure as well. Finally, just look at my country, Singapore, which is meant to be a smart nation. At least we hope to be a smart nation, meaning a cyber-enabled nation. But still, this has not prevented various major cyber hacks from taking place in Singapore, against Singapore, over the last few years. Hacks against universities, hacks against more than one government agency, and most recently, and notoriously, a hack against our healthcare system, the healthcare data, where over 1 million individuals' data was exfiltrated. I think that shows we need to talk more, we need to compare, contrast, share technical knowledge, and share discussions about norms, cyber norms. That is the complete package, and we're still somewhere at the beginnings of beginning to talk about the complete package.
But is there enough pressure from the people, from civil society organizations, from people who are in the industry, for the leaders to address this?
Industry should be segmented, in my view, into various components, and the Singapore cyber security strategy, which was unveiled about 2 years ago, makes it quite clear that when it comes to serious cyber threats, industry does have a role and responsibility to play. For example, in the case of a major hack, industry must give information, it must give cooperation, and in some cases, it must cooperate actively to allow government to come in to check, to control key critical information infrastructure, CII, that is at risk. So this is the right and proper way from the Singapore way of doing things. We do not obviously seek to prescribe to other ASEAN nations that this is the way that things should be done. But that's at the technical point of view. I think if we want a holistic understanding of how industry or NGOs should contribute to cyber, we have to accept that it's not just wholly technical, maybe 50%. What is the other 50%? Look at nations which use cyber means to try to undermine the resilience of the polity of the nation state, meaning social media, hybrid warfare, disinformation. There are many terms for this. But the key enabler or facilitator of this is cyber. Cyber means manipulating social media platforms, Twitter feeds. Now, for that to happen, even though governments are trying to legislate, my country has just legislated, I think you have to accept the industry has a part to play. For example, the content platforms, the Facebooks of the world, they were directly or indirectly responsible for facilitating this in the first place. And to give them some credit, they've become much better at this in recognizing the problem over the past couple of years. So that's industry, but the NGOs as well, especially the youth, the grassroots, where the common view would be that they are not cyber experts, not cyber enablers. I would differ, I would dissent from that view and would posit the view that in terms of building resilience in society, in the face of all this intolerance that we see through the social media mechanism, is actually the people and the young, the NGOs, grassroots activities, which have the key role to play in terms of rebuilding or shoring up resilience of society. So everyone has a role to play.
But let's look at state laws and how these cyber entities operate. They are a global operation. They operate in many countries. Should one country's law make any difference to their operation? If you can't go to Singapore, if you can't go to a small country in Southeast Asia, we go to the other big countries. Is there a lack in the cohesiveness or the power that a regional legislation can address that you see with as opposed to just individual countries' law?
There are a few things to bear in mind. It's a great question. One is that the power of the Facebooks, the Googles of the world almost approximates the power of nation states. They have control over the thinking and the trajectories of various peoples and various societies. Now, on the point of legislation, in some respects, Southeast Asia lags Europe. For example, Germany's got a Facebook law. That's the popular name for it. Other countries in Western Europe have sort of taken the lead in legislating on this issue. There are various nation states within ASEAN which are either on the cusp of legislating or have legislated cyber laws which have some control, have something to say about disinformation and fake news. Firstly, I think we have to respect and understand that every nation is sovereign in these matters. Singapore has just enacted what could loosely be called a fake news law. This, we think, works for the Singapore context. However, we will not try to preach and say that it applies to other nation states as well. I would say overall, when it comes to legislative means to deal with these things, we need to remember one thing. Firstly, and this tends to be forgotten in all this whole debate about fake news and intolerance, we need to remember firstly that the platforms of the world have actually been a force for good. They have been a sort of a denominator. To some degree, they have helped to enable society. They've changed our societies in many respects for the better. However, the platforms, when they started on these big endeavor 15 years ago, when the big platforms came up, had a promise or a premise. And what was this? They would be this great enabler, a common denominator where humankind would be linked and bonded together. There, in my view, the record is a lot more patchy. And to some degree, it has not happened. Not only has it not happened, to some degree they have played a role in the atomization of human societies, and various peoples have been torn asunder through the intolerance that this is facilitated. So if you look at Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg's comments about 2 months ago, when he finally, for the first time after years of saying no, accepts that there's a role for government intervention in this, co-regulation almost, right? And then on the other hand, you look at what Singapore has tried to do, and there were objections internationally and within Singapore to the fake news law. Look at what other ASEAN member states are trying to do. Is this not actually very, very similar to what Mark Zuckerberg is saying in terms of co-regulation and so on and so forth? So I'm not convinced that we are poles apart, and I'm convinced that there can or should be some means where we can cooperate in a beneficial fashion with the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. The one point I would make is that if Zuckerberg, and he comes close to saying this, suggests that they want one standard, one common understanding, one common regulation, which Facebook would then implement. He suggests something very close to this. And I'm not convinced by this at all, because as I just mentioned, if you look at the different cultural contexts, legal norms, mechanisms, understandings in terms of how societies are ordered, this is very much a national issue. So it is going to be complicated. And the Facebooks of the world have to accept that when they accept co-regulation, it is complicated, it devolves down to a national level. I think we are just at the start of the process, which will be years in the making.
Bertemu kembali, seterusnya, let's talk about the economic benefits and how a state which talks about the future of the economy, IR 4.0, all these jargons, they come together with these companies, the Facebook, the Googles, the social media platforms, and the economic benefits that could come to this country. How do you balance that, being hard on these companies and also trying to reap the benefits that they bring together with the promises that they can to this particular country?
From my personal point of view, I would think it is almost a particular point of pride that various key internet companies, including the big platforms, have chosen to root themselves in Singapore, which is a good thing. Not just root themselves, but have their key Asia-Pacific HQs, in some cases, in Singapore as well. So I would hope, again, as a think tank perspective, that they do not think that Singapore has been too hard on them. Rather, we're trying to reach some effective and meaningful arrangement where they can continue their operations, which obviously is driven by profit. These are profit-driven companies, and where they're public, they're answerable to their shareholders, while at the same time seeking to some degree, sometimes through legislation or other means, to protect Singaporeans and those residing within Singapore from echo chambers, fake news, filter bubbles, which the platforms, I'm sure they would agree, to some degree have facilitated. So I am pretty sure that in the lead-up to the Singapore legislation on these issues, there was quite a lot of behind-the-scenes confabulations and talking to make sure that the platforms understood what was doing, not necessarily to be hard on them, but to seek an equitable solution, not just for them, but for the Singapore polity, to make sure Singapore resilience is not undermined. So it is quite interesting in the immediate aftermath of the enactment of the Singapore Fake News Bill that the social media companies actually come out in public and say that they have certain reservations, but they will and are prepared to abide by the various tenets, the various provisions of the bill. This is very, very important, and to me it's a signifier or a signal that they understand what this is all about. Having said that, the hard yards, I think, still remain to be done, because there are many, many clauses in the Singapore Protection Against Online Falsehoods Bill, and it still remains to be seen what are the first cases that are actually caught by the bill. If, and this is my personal expectation, it's not an attempt to be censoring everything, it's not an attempt to be controlling all the information out there, but rather, if I read the bill correctly, the Singapore bill, it is to single out the particular egregious cases where there's a genuine corrosive effect. It can really undermine public confidence in what? In the public institutions, the institutions which underpin Singapore. Meaning it's actually quite a high threshold. This is my understanding of the bill. And I think once the people understand that, and once the social media platforms understand this, I think there will be a way to work harmoniously in terms of working social media companies with the government. But there's a second part to your question, which is in some ways even more important. Singapore, we sometimes like to think, is not any nation. We are a smart nation. We want to be a smart nation. And what does this mean? We live our lives which are not just digitally enabled with your smartphone. This is entry-level understanding, where government becomes better administratively through e-services, through connecting people, through databases, through big public data agglomerations, where we fuse what is known of the behaviors of Singaporeans or those in Singapore society and try to make their lives better. And much of the knowledge, or indeed the data sets, lies, partly within government, but actually partly within the social media companies themselves. So obviously, within any future Singapore which seeks to be a smart nation, there must be some efficient cooperation between government, people, private sector, and the social media companies themselves. It would be a great pity if, on account of what has happened, the legislation, the social media companies are sort of spooked and don't want to work, don't want to cooperate. I don't really see that happening, but I would like to set the stage, or think that what has happened is actually set the stage for ensuring Singapore is safe, secure, resilient, and tolerant, and then setting the stage for all the cooperation at the smart nation level, which will make Singapore a better society. I think this has to follow.
But do other countries in Southeast Asia have the same mindset as Singapore? When we look at the AMCC, we look at how the agreement is made on a very minimum level, the least contested by the other countries. How then this would set the tone for other countries in Southeast Asia? Do they have the same ability, the same mindset as Singapore to look at it that way, and to be saying that, you know, we can legislate these laws, these companies would have to meet in the middle and also somehow work together with us? Do other countries have the same privilege to say that to these big companies trying to establish their positions in Southeast Asia?
There are nation states within ASEAN which have, within this year, 2019, started to legislate on this issue. Vietnam is one, Thailand is another. And I think you have to understand and accept that they have their own domestic concerns, legitimate concerns about security as well. Of course, there will always be a criticism, just like there was criticism against the Singapore fake news bill as well. And the criticism may well be, just to give an example, the clauses within this bill are too large, too sweeping. They talk about national security in a way where almost anything is caught. Right? This is a consideration, I think, for the various ASEAN member states in question. They would almost certainly have made their own calculations about the right and wrongness of it, almost certainly have made their own calculations as to whether they can bring the social media companies to the table to cooperate or to surrender information or indeed equipment, depending on the clause, as dictated to by the law. And these are forward-looking countries which realize, I think, like Singapore, that social media companies are here to stay. They can't be sort of clamped down on to a level where they start to seriously think whether they should have a presence there for tomorrow. So that's very, very important. You talked about the low base of understanding on the AMCC. I would characterize it as this. This is a very, very sensitive issue where nation states have different sensitivities, different kinds of underminings of social resilience can be done through cyber or social media means. For example, Thailand, which is almost unique in a way, they have le majest laws, and within the Thai suite of legislation, this is covered. I think you have to understand and respect that there are certain domestic cultural contexts. Singapore obviously does not have le majest laws, but there are very, very tough laws now enacted in terms of what could be corrosive against the Singapore polity, because the Singapore calculation, different from the Thais, but we think we are small, we're very, very fragile. If the races or the creeds within Singapore are split against each other, habis, that's it for Singapore. So we all have different sensitivities. That's the higher level discussion. What does commonly not get talked about is actually quite meaningful and effective cooperation at the technical level, the CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, CERT to CERT cooperation, which goes on underreported, for obvious reasons, and sometimes not within the framework of the ASEAN AMCC. It could be on a bilateral level, for example. It could be on a security agency level, for example. We have to accept that this is an iceberg where there's quite a lot of it underwater.
But it's happening right now.
But it is happening.
Okay.
The technical cooperation in particular, which is very important.
Bertemu kembali. Seterusnya, let's look at state-sponsored disinformation. We saw that happen in Myanmar in 2017-2018 with regards to Facebook, where it was reported that military personnel were the one who posted postings, hate speech towards the Rohingyas in Myanmar. That is probably one of the examples, but looking at how many countries are going to going to have their elections end of this year, next year, do you see this? How do you see the urgency to address this particular issue, especially in Southeast Asia? You've got the threat of America and also China trying to establish a bigger presence in Southeast Asian countries. Do you see that or this becoming maybe worse in the future?
I'm not optimistic. I think it will get worse. There may be a silver lining, which I will come to. But let's start from the beginnings, from history. Nation states since the beginning of time have always preferred, if they can, some sort of informal pressure, diplomacy, or use of some means of influence if they could do it, if it achieved the objective. Why? Because it's much more effective sometimes than pure diplomacy. It's much less bloody and sometimes cheaper than warfare. I'm sure we all agree. What has really changed, since what I've described is not really new at all, what has really changed? And that's the advent, maybe not so much of the internet, but in particular social media. Social media has been a big entrant to our region, maybe over the last 10, 15 years. Yeah? And this can give a medium for people to get a message across, but also for nation states to subtly influence certain societies, certain nations in the direction of certain outcomes. Look at what Russia is alleged to have tried in the United States, and also obviously the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Similarly, with the more recent US midterms, similarly allegations of Russian involvement in various or attempted interference in various European elections, ranging, some say, from Brexit to the Macron leaks, meaning the presidential election in France, and even German elections. They can do it, and they will do it because they have a great deal of plausible deniability. Because when you try to track back, when you try to accuse, when you try to technically show you are responsible for this, responsible for that, the actor can always say, no, I was not doing anything. They can attempt to hide their tracks. Right? For example, Singapore had a parliamentary select committee, an inquiry onto these issues, state-sponsored and also fake news generally, in February, March last year. The public report is online, you can read it. And it said that Singapore, a small country like Singapore, security agencies briefed this committee, said that Singapore has been a victim of or site of state-sponsored disinformation attacks. And they said more than one, more than one. So if you think about it, if Singapore can be a victim, what really are they trying to do? We cannot pretend to be a big power. We are a locus within a very, very interesting region. But then if you dig very deeply and if you understand the concerns, you really understand the threats, because Singapore, we like to think, is not any nation. You've got Chinese, Malays, Indians, all kinds of races, creeds, ideologies within. From the Singapore threat perception, it may well be that if a threat actor attempts to split off one particular group, one particular race or ideology or creed, in order to give a certain message, in order to change Singapore society slowly but surely, like the boiled frog analogy, so slowly that you don't even realize it's happening. Actually, not only is this quite an insidious threat, but it is potentially more serious than, don't you think, even the terrorism. Terrorism is very serious. People can die. But in the aftermath of terrorist attack, you can try to arrest people, you can try to de-radicalize people, you can try to repair the infrastructural damage, you can try to heal the wounds of society. But how about the slow burn threats, the disinformational, the hybrid warfare threats? This thing can be decades in the making, meaning under attack, disinformationally speaking, using social media means, and you don't even realize it. And by the time you catch it, what are your effective countermeasures? Terrorists, you can try to de-radicalize, sometimes successful. What kind of counter-narrative do you have against a slow burn threat that is slowly poisoning society and undermining societal resilience? Very, very difficult.
So you're leaving it to the users to sieve and to make their own informed judgment about this information. Do you believe the users can really do that?
I would like to see users which are not just smart in a smart nation. I want to see them wise. Wise is much more difficult to do. To understand how to read critically, to discern bias, agenda, slant, interpretation, weasel words. That kind of society which has a core cadre of people like that, who knows, 20%, 30%, is going to be that much more immune to the very, very modern day fake news, hybrid attack, disinformational warfare. That's the conundrum. The way to defeat this is not necessarily through social media means, is to rediscovering lost skills.
20-30%, what about the majority of the population?
I live in a country, Singapore, which is swiftly going digital. And I would think it is correct to say that there are people in think tanks, I am not the only one by the way, who are trying to give the message maybe that digital is good. We accept it's the future, it's the way of the future, but don't lose the text. Don't lose the ability to read beyond 160 characters. Don't lose the ability to, not just parse, not just skim, but to read, to imbibe. And I'm sure you know there's increasing literature, academic study, which suggests that the real imbibing, the real absorption, even if you read the same thing, text and digital, it's not the same actually. It's actually in the text. We have to remember that.
On that note, we thank you very much, Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, Head Centre of Excellence for National Security, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore, for joining us today. Dan itu tadi Dr. Shashi Jayakumar membicarakan berkenaan dengan keselamatan cyber dan juga Asia Tenggara dan juga bagaimanakah kita harus dan boleh memastikan bahawa pengguna media sosial dapat memastikan maklumat yang mereka terima adalah benar dan juga menyumbang kepada kecelikan digital secara keseluruhannya. Saya Rizal Zulkapli, ini AWANI Global. Salam hormat.